Hey, what's up? Seth here. In this video, I wanted to explain one of the biggest challenges I had when building my first self-storage facility. So the challenge I'm talking about is the parking lot. That's right, the part that should have been the easiest in the part of the property that generates the least amount of revenue per square foot ended up being one of the biggest hassles and annoyances in getting this place market ready. And after having this facility open for about a year, we came to the conclusion that we just didn't set it up right. And we decided to just hit the reset button and start over and just redesign this thing for a couple different reasons. So the two biggest challenges with this parking lot was, first of all, figuring out the right unit mix. And when I say unit mix, I'm talking about the number of parking spaces, the size of those parking spaces, and how they should all be laid out and situated throughout the parking lot. And also how we marked each parking space on site. So, when somebody is driving their car or their trailer by and they see the different parking spaces, how are we going to show them, hey, here's our parking space. This is where you're supposed to park. This includes not just putting lines down to indicate where the parking spaces were, but also putting some kind of number there to indicate, hey, this is the unit number for the parking space you've been assigned to. This might sound like a really minor, inconsequential thing, but the thing we had going against us is that we have a gravel parking lot. So if this was an asphalt parking lot, this would be super simple. You just paint the lines, maybe paint down some numbers, and you're done. That paint's going to stay there for 10 plus years. No big deal. But when you have gravel, paint doesn't stay on gravel. It comes off with the rain, it comes off with the wind, it comes off with snow, and especially snow plows. Even if you put down a couple layers of thick oil-based paint, within about a year, it's going to be pretty hard, if not impossible, to see that paint. So the answer is you have to keep painting it on again and again, or find some other semi-permanent way to indicate where these lines are. If you've ever tried to put together and manage your own gravel parking lot, you probably know what a challenge this can be. It's kind of annoying. In fact, this can be such an annoyance that some people I know that have these kind of gravel parking lots just don't bother with parking lines and numbers at all. It's just a big gravel field and people can figure it out. And you can do that, but it also means at some point your parking lot's going to be a mess because nobody knows where to go. So they're just going to park in probably the least efficient way possible. So if you want to have any sense of organization and utilizing your space the best you possibly can, it helps a lot to be able to have a sensible way to lay out your parking lot and tell people where each parking space is, so that once they rent a unit, once they're assigned their number, they know exactly where to go. And this kind of thing can ultimately have a big impact on how much money you end up making over the long term and how much of a hassle it is to manage your storage facility. And after doing a ton of research and doing it the wrong way to start with, I think we finally figured out the best way to do this. So just to give you a quick recap in case you've never seen me before, if you've never seen my series about how I built this self-storage facility, just explain what's going on here. So from the summer of 22 to the summer of 2023, I built my first self-storage facility. This facility consisted of 4 buildings and 170 enclosed drive-up units with roll-up doors. This was 27,600 square feet on 6.7 acres, so it only took up half of the parcel. On the other half of the parcel, I could have put buildings there too, but seeing as how this was my first facility I had ever built, I wanted to go slow and do it in 2 phases. So in this first phase, on one half of the property, we were just going to leave it as a gravel parking lot and use it for outdoor boat and RV storage, which doesn't make nearly as much money per square foot, but it's also a lot easier and faster to develop, and it's a way to enter the market without dumping so much money into the project up front. And initially, when we designed this parking lot, my goal was to fit as many units in there as possible to maximize our revenue potential. So most of the units that we planned to put here were 12 foot by 30 foot spaces, and a handful of them were 12 by 40 spaces. And interestingly, about 9 or 10 months after opening up the facility, we found that those bigger 12 by 40 units leased up very quickly, and the 12 by 30 units, people just weren't that interested in these things. And in hindsight, given what I've learned about this market, it's actually no surprise. In my market, there is a much higher demand for parking larger boats and vehicles. You can almost look at it in terms of the larger that vehicle is, the greater the need for that person to find a place to park it. When you think about something small, like, I don't know, a pop-up trailer or like a single vehicle or something like that, it's not that hard for a person to just park that in their own backyard or in their own driveway. But when you talk about a larger item, like a giant boat or like a 50-foot long RV or something like that, that's a lot harder. to park it in your yard. In fact, some neighborhoods and HOAs may even disallow it, saying you're not allowed to park that here. So the inconvenience of owning that thing and having to find a place to park it goes up and up. So really, what the market needs is places to park those larger items. And when I configured my parking lot to be mostly those 12 by 30 spaces, I was basically designing this facility so that it couldn't be used by the people who most need this kind of product. And the results showed that pretty quickly. So again, about 9 or 10 months into it, the way we decided to do this was to make as many of those larger spaces as possible and really only make small ones just to fill in the gaps if there was any empty usable space for that. But for the most part, we tried to make these all 12 by 40 or 12 by 50 parking spaces with a handful of 12 by 30 and a handful of 12 by 20. But again, we were really focusing on those larger ones with the idea being if you have a small RV or boat to store, you can rent one of those larger units. That's totally possible. But if you have a huge one, like 12 by 50 feet or 12 by 40, you cannot rent a smaller unit. So the idea is to really just provide as many of those large units as possible. And the results turned out pretty well. Those large spots leased up pretty quickly, and there's not a whole lot of empty spaces now in our parking lot. Now, one of the tricky things about laying out a parking lot like this is that it's not just about having enough space to put the parking spaces themselves. You also have to have a wide enough drive aisle so that people can turn these things and back into the spots and preferably pull through in as many spots as possible so that people don't need to be very skilled drivers to get their RVs and boats in place. Remember, these people are not professional semi-truck drivers who do this stuff all the time. They're kind of amateurs in a lot of cases, and they're not necessarily good or skilled at driving these things. So you don't want to force them to be skilled at driving them. You just want to make it super easy for anybody. And it's kind of painful to do this because the wider you make the drive aisle, the less of that space you can now monetize because you can't use that for parking spaces. It also makes a difference depending on whether your parking spaces are such where people have to make a 90-degree turn to get in there or if they are diagonal. Makes a difference in terms of how much space you need in that drive aisle for people to back in or pull through. We had ours on an angle, which has its own little set of pros and cons, but one of the advantages of that is that you don't need as big of an aisle because people don't have to turn as sharp to get in there, assuming they're coming from the right direction. So you can see on the screen here what our original layout used to look like, and then you can see what the updated one looks like. I'll just kind of leave it here on the screen so you can kind of get an idea for how big the spaces are and how we placed them and how big the drive aisles are and all that. Now, another really interesting challenge with this that I didn't really anticipate, and that is, how do you actually mark these parking spaces, especially when you're dealing with gravel? Because gravel is not like asphalt where you just paint it once and it stays there in place for, 10 plus years. And then you also have to figure out how to label each parking space, or at least that's how we wanted to do it in our case, because when we assign somebody to a specific parking space with a specific size, we want them to know exactly where to go and not take the wrong space. And that's a whole other set of challenges because how do you put numbers in place that will actually stay there and be visible? Just kind of a weird challenge that I didn't anticipate up front being such a hard thing, but it was hard. And I've actually asked a lot of people on the internet about the best way to do this. I've gotten all kinds of different answers, and the general consensus is that there is no perfect way to do this, no matter how you decide to put lines on gravel and or label each parking space. There are advantages and disadvantages to whatever you decide to do. And it also depends on whether or not you're in an area where you get a lot of snow, because if you have snow and if you ever have to plow that snow, or even if you don't plow it and the snow just piles up, that can also have a different impact in terms of your ability to see the lines or whatever you put there to label each parking space. So I'm going to start by explaining the original way that I decided to do this, which I thought was brilliant, and then why it eventually didn't end up working out that well for us and what we decided to do instead. So originally, I knew of another storage facility owner near me who kind of came up with this homemade idea of making a parking delineator or parking post with PVC pipe and a swimming pool noodle down the center being held in place by a piece of rebar, and then spray some insulating foam in between the gaps just to help keep everything tight and in place, and then a topper on it, and then some custom-made metal signs that he would screw into each pipe. And in the end, it actually looked like a pretty sharp product, and it's a lot less expensive than if you were to go out and like buy a bunch of these delineators on Amazon. For what they are, these things are surprisingly expensive. It's fine if you just need to get like 5 or 10 of them, but I needed to get about 95 of these things, and it would have been like thousands of dollars to buy a proper delineator from Amazon or one of these places that sells it. Another alternative would have been to buy like a concrete bumper, which are also fairly expensive and super heavy and hard to move around. But with these PVC pipe delineators, they would stick up pretty far so snow would never cover the number. You'd always be able to see that. And they also have a little bit of give to them, so you can like knock into them or like drive a car into them or bump into them. It's not going to hurt the car, and as long as you don't drive over the thing, will most likely stay in place. And they also look pretty sharp. So I ordered up a bunch of these pipes from my local Home Depot or Lowe's, I think it was. They delivered it on a truck. I will say there's different thicknesses to this type of pipe. Originally, I tried to just go into my local Home Depot and buy them that way, but the thickness of this pipe when you buy it in the store directly off the shelf is way too thick, which made them a lot heavier and harder to work with, and worst of all, a lot more expensive, especially when you're buying close to 100 of these things. So just be aware, if you want the right thickness, I had to buy them online and get them shipped to me on a truck from Lowe's, and they came in a length of about 10 feet, and I had to saw them in half to get them to be the right height. I was not able to buy this by just walking into the store. I had to do like a special order. I also got some 4-foot rebar, and that was actually surprisingly difficult to pound into gravel, so be prepared for that if you ever decide to do this. And it did end up being fairly cost effective for the end product we got, but it took a lot of time and work to get these things in there. I think if you've got a facility where you have maybe 10 or fewer parking spaces, this is a pretty decent way to do it, but if you have as many as I did, I definitely would not have done this in hindsight. So some of the problems we ended up having with this was, especially in the winter time, we had a snowplow that would push big, mounds of snow, and it totally took some of these things out. Some people did end up driving over them and ruining them. And even when there were like big gusts of wind, which we get on our facility from time to time, because it's basically like a little field where wind just kind of whips through there, it can like catch the signs and rotate them on the rebar. So long term, it just didn't end up working that well. And when we knew we were going to totally reconfigure this parking lot, we knew, okay, this is a good opportunity to do away with this failed system that we thought was going to work so well and just come up with a new way to mark each one of these parking spaces with numbers and also put down lines on the gravel in a way that would be semi-permanent. But when we knew we were going to totally redo this, I had heard of a few other facility owners out there with similar parking lots that came up with some creative ways to make these lines actually stay there long term. I heard of one person who pounded rope over the lines. So basically you get the lines painted just to understand where the lines are supposed to be. Once the lines are painted, that's when you would take like some yellow rope and then get some landscaping stakes and, tack that rope into the ground so it actually stays there. I saw some other examples of people who were putting rebar in the ground similar to how I did it, but instead of putting a PVC pipe over it, they would just leave the rebar there, and there was a plastic bit at the top that would feed some rope through it just to make it more visible. I also knew of another guy who runs a semi-truck parking lot in Georgia, and he actually used this 1-inch by 4-inch plastic boarding that's normally used to build like Adirondack chairs, and he would take these boards and with just 6-inch landscaping stakes, he would pound them into the ground, and I actually thought that was a pretty smart idea. I've only heard of one person who's done that, but he kind of swears by it. The nice thing is, if you ever want to like move your parking spaces around, or if you ever sell your property and want to start a new parking lot somewhere else, or if you totally reconfigure your parking lot like I did, you can just take these boards up and take them with you. And I mean, they're like boards. They're going to last a long time. So I think that's a pretty solid way to do it. It's not how we did it though. So I had heard of one other person in a self-storage Facebook group using yellow and black barricade tape, which is basically just yellow and black fabric made of plastic, and it keeps its color long term so it doesn't fade in the sun very easily, and it just sticks out like a sore thumb, and it's really easy to see. And it's similar to the idea of putting rope over the painted lines just to keep those lines in place and not lose sight of where they are after the paint fades. It's just that this is even more visible because it's a wider surface area, and with that yellow and black combination, it just stands out really well even over gravel. Yellow paint is actually fairly hard to see on gravel, as you may have noticed from watching this video, but this yellow and black barricade tape stands out much better and is very easy to see. And to install this, you would use a similar method with 6 to 12-inch landscaping stakes that you pound in, and you pound it through that barricade tape. You might want to use like a washer or something just to grab it really well and tack it all the way down, and put those stakes maybe every 3 or 4 feet or so, depending on what's needed. I can say with almost complete certainty, this is going to last a heck of a lot longer than just paint on gravel. gravel would. This barricade tape is not expensive at all, and it works very well, and it's very resilient just in terms of sticking around and lasting a lot longer than many other things would. And as for labeling each of the parking spaces, so we ended up using these fairly inexpensive for what they are, rubber or plastic bumpers. I'm not entirely sure what this specific material is, but they're just very resilient and fairly small bumpers. I believe they're 21.5 inches wide and 3.5 inches tall with reflectors on them, so they're fairly easy to see. And that's kind of what indicates where the end of the parking space is, but it's not just about that. It's also about putting a number or something on it to indicate, hey, this is the label for the parking space that you're supposed to take. It's one thing to have like a map of every single unit on your website or a big sign out front that shows people where to go, but it's another thing to actually have that label on the actual parking space so people can get there and be like, okay, here it is. I can say with absolute certainty, this is where I'm supposed to be. What I ended up using for this were these little 4x4 white and black plastic numbered signs, which I don't think is supposed to be used for this at all, but it works perfect for this. All you got to do is screw them into the bumpers and they work like a charm. I actually heard about these signs and these rubber bumpers as the solution for this from my friend John Farling, who I've interviewed a couple times. He's an awesome, very experienced self-storage investor. I gotta say, it worked pretty well. The way we got these bumpers to stay in place is by hammering some 12-inch pieces of rebar through the bumpers into the ground. I believe these things come with their own bolts in the package, but that was not going to work at all for the gravel that we were trying to get it through. Hammering anything through gravel, at least the kind of gravel that we are using, which is 22A gravel, is very hard. It's almost like trying to hammer something into concrete because this gravel just locks in place and it's very, very hard to get anything to penetrate that. However, another way you can kind of help yourself out is to get a drill with a masonry drill bit on the end and basically just drill holes right where you're going to be pounding the rebar or the stakes. It's still going to be hard, but it'll make it a little bit less hard because it's going to sort of make a path for those stakes and the rebar to go down. And one of the last challenges I'll mention here is the fact that we already had a lot of tenants parked in this parking lot. So how are you supposed to hit the reset button and totally reconfigure it when there's already a bunch of tenants all over the place? And luckily, this parking lot is split into a north and a south end. So what we did was we had everybody clear out of the south side. We worked on reorganizing and reconfiguring that and putting new lines and parking spaces down. Once that was done, we had everybody then slowly migrate to the south over the course of a month or so. And then we did the north side. And it worked out pretty well. With this improved layout, there's been just a lot less confusion about where people are supposed to park. And if people want to back over or drive over these bumpers with numbers on them, that's okay. They're not going to go anywhere. They're stuck in place. The only downside I could think of is if we do ever get a lot of snow and don't plow these spots, it would only take, about 4 or 5 or 6 inches to completely cover these things so you wouldn't even see them. Although I'm also finding that during the winter months, we don't get a whole lot of new parking tenants in the first place. People kind of get their boats and RVs to where they're going to be for the winter and they just kind of leave them there. So, it may be an issue at some point, but I don't think it's like that huge of an issue. It's not something to lose sleep over. So anyway, just wanted to share this update and share a key lesson that has been learned from running this storage facility. If anybody else out there has this kind of a gravel parking lot, and if you have any uncertainty about the placement of the parking spaces or how big they should be or how to mark them off and make them clear on site where they are, learned a lot of big lessons from all this stuff. And I'm probably going to continue learning lessons on this, but this is probably the biggest bulk of learning is over this past year as we realized we needed to make a change and then what we changed it to, and also how it's been going so far since we made those changes. So hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.